I'll just put it on myself. Hey everyone, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Today I have Matt Barrett back on the channel. Very excited talking about his new book. So before we get into that, I just wanted to give some updates about the channel-wise. So now you can become a supporter of OTD through YouTube. You can become what I've called team members, because I see those who support me through Patreon and these different ones as part of the team. Without you guys, I can't do these great stuff, get extra things, make the channel better, all that stuff, new tech, which I'm going to be hopefully fixing this week. Tried to get a new camera last week, did not go well, as some of you know. So I'm going to try and fix that, get some new tech. So you can help me with that by becoming a channel member for just a few bucks a month. It's a big help. So we'll check that out. Check out Patreon as well. Links are down below. So, like I said, today we are talking to Matt Barrett about his Hill 70 book. He has been on the channel before about his more traditional academic monograph about the work from his dissertation about conduct of Canadian officers. This one's a different one. We've got it right here. It's awesome. If you've been following me on Twitter lately, you've seen how much I'm talking about this thing. It's great. So it's a graphic history about Hill 70, but it's way more than that, and I'll let Matt explain what all of that means, but I just want to show this off, and there's links to buy it down below. I got mine through Indigo, and a good price, 20 bucks, like I said on Twitter. Like, I feel like I'm stealing for that cheap. Like, this is like heavy duty work that I know Matt and with his co-author, Robert Engen, have been working on this for, I don't even know. We'll get into that. It's been a long time, but again, it feels like this is a steal. So we'll bring Matt in and we'll get going. Like always, if you have questions or anything like that, fire away. Ooh. Almost hit the wrong button there. That would have been bad. I would have taken you out. Sorry, Matt. Thanks for coming on again. How's it going?
Thanks for having me on. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, I'm excited because I've known you for a long time now, and you've been telling me about this book even before all of the other iterations came out of it and everything. So finally excited to get my hands on the copy that I always wanted to get my hands on a couple of days ago and have you on to talk about it. So we already kind of did that intro with your last appearance with your dissertation inspired book. So this one's different, right? Hill 70, that wasn't like what you focused on academically speaking. So how did this come about? I know it's complicated. I know the story, but I'm sure a lot of people don't. You talk about it briefly in the book, but if you can give us some insights on this one, especially because it's Hill 70. Like, I've done live streams on here before, talked about it before. It's a bit of a different one. So how does that come into this format? How did that happen?
Thanks for the intro. So Hill 70, for those who don't know, is a battle in August of 1917 between the much more famous Vimy Ridge in April and Passchendaele in November. So for a long time, it was kind of a forgotten victory that the Canadians had. And it was the first battle that Arthur Currie was the Corps commander of the Canadian Corps. And 2013, 2014, a group in Kingston called the Hill 70 Memorial Project came together, and it included some ex-military people, some former teachers, and all sorts of kind of historically minded folks. And they thought that this is a battle that should be commemorated. And they worked together, and they did an amazing job fundraising. And ultimately, in 2017, they monuments that's now currently standing near the sites of Hill 70 in France. And a large amount of their attention was focused on fundraising for this monument and building the monuments. But pretty quickly, they realized that without an education component, people won't understand why Hill 70 is important and why we should commemorate it. So they hired on as the senior historian, my co-author on this book, Robert Engen. And he did great work for them of researching them and putting it in the proper context. And about 2014, 2015, I came on board, did some research for them. And Rob knew I liked to draw. He always had an interest in comics and graphic novels. And so we started to think about, as part of this education package that the project was putting together, why not include a visual component, a comic book style adaptation of the battle? And I think that'd be great to reach out to younger readers and kids, and it fit right in with what their focus was going to be on students in high schools. And so what we produced was this relatively thin, as you can see, graphic novel that I illustrated, that Rob wrote. And it was the start of our foray into this graphic history concept. I've always liked to draw, and I've always liked history, but I've never really connected those two things when I'm thinking about my academic career. Right. So this was really the first kind of historically themed book I was working on, and we produced another one for them a couple years later, and there was a lot of demand for them from teachers, but it's a relatively small organization, so they didn't have the resources to make it broadly available to everyone. And so in 2019, Rob and I came together again and said, why don't we propose a book length version? And what we produced through McGill Queens, as you can see, what began as this, it became this. And so this is the hardcover version. Brad has the soft cover at the moment. And so what it is it's exploration of the Battle of Hill 70, but it's also about, I think, more broadly, about how we visualize and understand the First World War.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that's great because you break it down again. I want people to get the book. I'm just gonna be all right. Say that, get the book if you can, because it's new, right? It just came out. Well, it got released in this form just recently, right? It just
it digitally released was, and I should know this. I mean, this is August 14th. This is just about the 105th anniversary of the Battle of Hill 70, which began August 15th of 1917. So this book was released August 9th.
Perfect. Yeah, I thought so. I thought it was recent. Sorry, the days have been running together for me lately, so I forget what day is which. And you had your other book also, which is still awaiting its complete full release. So I was getting those two mixed up.
Yes.
Anyway, so it comes out. So again, get it if you can. All through different outlets. There's a few links down below. You can buy through there to help me out, and Matt and Robert out as well. But anyway, just to get this, because the one thing that struck me, like we were talking about before, I didn't get through it as much as I'd like. Because me and Matt were talking about this because we both have the PhDs. We've done the same education. It's sometimes you just read just to get through it, get it done, get the information you need, and get out and get on to the next thing. I wanted to enjoy this, not only because I know how long and how hard you guys have been working on this one. Like you said, this has been going on for a long time. So I know the work is into this. I know the research is into this. I know the story's into this. It's all that. So I want to take the time and enjoy the illustrations, especially because I know how hard you've been working on these, and they're amazing. They're so good. Again, Matt's not told me to say any of this. I'm doing this all on my own accord. It's great. It's so good. I just want to be able to enjoy it and take it in, right? So I haven't really pushed through. But all that to say, what I wanted to say is that you talk about this. And that's one of the things I wanted to kind of to talk about a little bit with you is representations of war and what that means. And it's not so simple as it quite might seem, right? Because you talk about the trepidation of certain people toward this type of work, or graphic novels, or the graphic mediums, period. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, if there was sort of any roadblocks and troubles you guys had with kind of getting people on board with this, is because I've never seen anything like this in a Canadian context. Like you mentioned some others in the book, but they're not like this. This is a university press. Mm-hmm. Like, was that difficult to do? Was that full of roadblocks?
As you mentioned, it is, to my knowledge, one of the first historical graphic histories published by a Canadian university press, and I believe the First World War, to focus on Canada. So there's a sort of two issues with creating this type of book, because as you mentioned, it's novel, it's somewhat experimental, in that I think what most people would think of when they hear about a academic, scholarly academic book would be it's all text. Maybe there's some pictures nestled in the center that photographs or something. But I mean, history is a text-based discipline. So there might be sort of some trepidation among historians about what is this idea of adding visuals and fictionalization and imagination. So that's sort of maybe the academic I don't want to say objection to, but maybe concerns about this type of book as a scholarly source. And then what I can get into a bit later is just the ethics or the challenges of depicting warfare in a comic book style. There's a long history of war comics, action comics that were seen to be glorifying battle and glorifying war. And what we attempt to do in the book is to sort of subvert a lot of that, those notions of glorification of war through art, through propaganda. So to begin with the first kind of academic challenge of creating the book, as I mentioned, I'd always liked to draw and I liked history. Only recently have I thought, well, these two things can be combined. So when I was thinking after my PhD of postdoc ideas, I worked with Tim Cook at the War Museum to do a postdoc on graphic history at the War Museum. And a lot of the drawing for the book happened when I was a postdoc there. So I had kind of that interest in finding ways of promoting alternative ways of exploring history and disseminating our research to the broader public. So I think that it can go a long way of getting someone to pick up, instead of a dense, text-based book. If you include pictures, it's a little more accessible for them, but it doesn't mean that it's any less nuanced or any less challenging than someone that is picking up just a text-based book. So what I think that historical graphic history can do is it forces the historian to think about the decisions that they make in how are they telling the story of the past. When it's in text, there's all sorts of ways that you can sort of get around having to actually visualize what it is that you're explaining. It's just written. You leave it up maybe to the imagination of the reader, but you don't need to think about necessarily of how this history actually looked. So first, it forces you to think about, can I create a semi-realistic depiction of the past? And then when you ask that question, you come to, is that even the appropriate method to take to try to do a realistic depiction of the past? Because so much of the visuals is subjective and dependent on imagination, and you can try to base it on historical sources, but ultimately it's still your interpretation. And I think that's one really good thing that graphic history can do, is it exposes the fact that what's being presented is the interpretation and in some ways the construction of the historian.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to just jump in. That's a really good point, because I try to bring that up all the time in different ways, and kind of, because as you know, and as people know, I like to subvert and change things around and kind of mix it up and see what comes out. So I mean, that's a perfect way to think about it, right? That there's always choices being made. I mean, there was a huge row on Twitter the other day about bias and all this stuff. And I'm like, we're all biased. It's impossible to not have bias. I mean, language is even a bias. So that is another thing I think is so great, because it makes you stop and think in a way, which obviously academics are all about. And this leads to a question from Susan actually about that. So, I mean, again, I know the answers, and in this case, there's two things from this actually I want to talk about. So she asked, do graphic novels based on history have footnotes? Can you speak to yours first? And then I want to kind of talk about graphic novels and history and what that means.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that we can make a distinction between a graphic novel and a graphic history. And they can be used interchangeably. It's no big deal. But a graphic novel I think of as primarily a fictionalized story. So although they can have footnotes, I wouldn't view them as essential to have footnotes. You can have a fictionalized, historically based graphic novel. But in my case, with a graphic history, we included about 50 pages of footnotes and endnotes to document my artistic choices about why I decided to depict certain events. Exactly.
There's a lot of them, which is awesome to me. I mean, that's great. Sorry, cut in, but I mean, I love that.
Yeah, I think it's essential for if it's going to be considered a scholarly book, and with a university press, that I think you need to have that kind of documentation. And I think it's good to let the reader know the choices that you're making, about why you decided to depict things a certain way. And there's also maybe some different meanings in the pictures that be obvious, but then you can refer back to the footnotes and see, oh, this is where they got this idea, or this is what this is referencing. So mine does have fairly substantial footnotes. Sourcing is a bit of a tricky issue with creating this kind of book. You don't want the text to be overriding the pictures. But there's also just the kind of practical issue of you have the pictures on one page, and then on the back at the end of the book, you have these footnotes, and you might have to be referring back and forth. So there might be different ways of sourcing your material. Now, one thing that we do sometimes is include the actual documents or photographs in the book itself, within the pictures, to just kind of illustrate how we are sourcing what we draw.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. So yeah, well, you covered the whole graphic novel. Actually, I want to come back to that in a bit, if that's all right, because I have a question about that. But I want to keep going on this train. So you start with what I think was a great choice. You do like the setup, like academic books, and how that goes, right? There's an intro, which is great. What really struck me, and I think was an amazing choice, is hopefully this can be seen. So, and I've talked about this on the channel with Carla-Jean Stokes and on Twitter all the time, is this photo, right? Over the top. Sorry. Keep forgetting it's mirrored. Yeah, so over the top, right? And you look at it, right, in different ways. Like, that is just mind-blowing to me. It was a great choice. Was that a natural choice? Did that take some thinking coming to that? Like, how did that come? Because it's not Hill 70, right? Because there's a whole thing going on behind that one. So was that like a natural choice or anything like that? Or was it, or not? I don't know.
Well, I was influenced. I was definitely influenced by the great work of Carla-Jean Stokes, and looking at the mythology that grew up around that over-the-top image. But that first chapter came relatively late in the creation of the book. So we had two of the chapters were based on the two original graphic novels that we created for the Hill 70 project. And it was about, and then we knew we wanted to do a bigger section on Curry himself. So that's the second chapter about Curry's rise as the Corps commander and his operations at Hill 70. So we knew we wanted to tell those stories. But it was about trying to connect them in a way that made sense and made sense in a scholarly way. So I realized, kind of late in the game, that we needed to have an introductory chapter that dealt directly with what we're trying to achieve, broader scale, with graphic history. And so the photo, I thought, was a great way to introduce this topic. So for those who don't know, the over-the-top picture was taken by Ivor Castle, who was Canada's official war photographer, at a training ground in 1916, and it's being conflated with an actual action shot of Canadian troops in battle, and it's become almost a cliche.
Every battle.
If you look up the First World War, you'll see it all.
It's used for
time everywhere. Castle himself sort of implied in his writings that he was in the trenches and took it. And so one of the things I do is I depict that. I show him as he had described it. If he's in the trenches and this is happening, as he described, with bullets and bombs raging overhead. And then I cut to what actually happened was he took it at a training ground and using the early Photoshop of its day, meshed it with scenes of explosions in the background. I mean, from a technical standpoint, it's pretty impressive.
It is, for sure.
But it created the mythology that this was a real photograph taken in battle. And Ivor Castle's successor, a guy named William Ryder, who was an English photographer, he in later life claimed that he had to live down this implication that war photographers were just out there taking pictures and fabricating them and manipulating them. And so I wanted to use those two perspectives on Castle's idea of creating a fictionalized, fabricated photo, and Ivor Castle and Ryder's claim that he just took shots of troops as he found them, and look at what do we really mean by realism and authenticity? Why is it that photograph of troops going over the top provokes this kind of reaction from historians that says, "Oh, this is fictional, fabricated," whereas if it's a war painting, we can say that Richard Jack's second Yeeps is clearly an imagining. It doesn't purport to reality. It's obviously sort of his own interpretation. So standard to this photograph as we do to war art. And so I was kind of interested in why is that the case? And so I came upon this sort of concept of the uncanny valley, which those in CGI know about. If you're trying to create a realistic human, it reaches a stage where you either need to push through the valley into creating indistinguishable from a actual human, or you need to retreat back into more abstract or simplified form. Otherwise, it provokes this kind of negative reaction from people that they know it's realistic, but it's not quite there. And so that's what I think is happening with the Ivor Castle photograph. That it provokes this kind of uncanny valley effect. That it's realism because it's actually taken of human beings in the context of the war, but it's purporting to be from battle. So that's what I think provokes this kind of uncanny valley effect. And as I talk about, maybe to justify my own art style, it justifies my use of more of a simplified, rough, semi-realistic, illustrated form. At one point, I create some fictionalized photographs just to demonstrate what I think would be a sort of a jarring reaction of people if I was to create the entire book as realistic photos that aren't real, pieced together from different photos. And in part, that's also reaction to something that you in history would be well aware of, is the tendency of historians to focus on the minute details, on is this accurate, is this uniform accurate, is this weapon accurate? And so part of that entire explanation of the uncanny valley and everything is just me saying you can only get so far with realism. And in fact, if you're striving for realism, if you're striving to make all the guns accurate and all the uniforms accurate, that's just going to emphasize more when you miss something. So it's the difference of drawing this more of a simplified figure that evokes the First World War, as opposed to trying to do a photorealistic character that people are going to see. Oh, you've missed this, you missed that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can't win. Right, it's one of those you can't win. It's just I mean, exactly what you say. Right, there's always that one thing, whatever it may be. One thing I wanted to ask about that. Again, I'm going to undo what I just said. And one of the things I noticed, and because you talk about it in the book, again, still talking about over the top. I didn't know this until reading yours, is that the action on the rifles was covered. in that photo. Some of them, I had no idea that, like, and I noticed this. I don't know if it was a choice or just what happened, because I noticed, because I went back after I read that, and some of the things you've drawn, they don't have it on the rifles. After that, they do. Was that a purposeful choice? Like, that was done with the research intention behind it?
Yeah, that was purposeful. So when it's depicting Ivor Castle's depiction of what he claims to have happened, I show the guns without, and then when I depict riders, they do. So, and then that's a sort of example of what I was talking about. That
exactly.
By having the canvases still on the guns, it acknowledges that it's not being taken in battle. So is that an oversight by Ivor Castle? Should he have told them to take it off? Should he have used his kind of photoshopic type techniques to erase that? But it's just an example of, if you're having a realistic depiction of something, a detail like that will be made more obvious when you're trying to project that this was something that actually happened.
Yeah, and I want to bring that up because I think it's completely indicative of what you say. It was kind of one of those brain exploding moments, because it's all choices, right? These things are deliberately done. They're, even, I'm talking about anything, right, with art and written art, for film, whatever, all of it's a deliberate choice, right? So that to me was mind blowing. But I think that explains it in a way, in a simplicity, and that doesn't mean in a bad way. I mean this in the best way. I mean this in a great way. Is, I think if you tried to do that just with text, it gets lost, because I don't think, like you were saying, right, making that connection, understanding it, I don't think that happens if you just say, oh, they didn't have the rifles, they had the rifles covered, okay, great. But this, you can be like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, you had to go and do that, right? You had to make these choices to show how these things can and cannot be presented. And to me, like, that is what the gem of this is. Again, that's the historian in me, is it's a history, but it's also talking about how the history is made. I mean, it's like, getting behind the scenes here, seeing how the sausage is also made at the same time, which I love. There's a lot of people I know, like, who will know I love the historiography. I love all that stuff. So to me, that was mind blowing and worth this book in and of itself. So that's why I wanted to bring that up, because to me, that was just such a great detail that I missed at first, and I had no idea. So it's great. So just going to change direction here a little bit, because Charlotte's watching, who's been on the channel and has an amazing book that I've talked about a bunch of times. She's asking about the peer review, and she's a former colleague of yours from Queens. Peer review. I mean, I thought the same thing. If you can, what does that even look like, right? How does that work?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. Peer review obviously is always a challenge, even if you're just dealing with more traditional articles and books. But we had a relatively smooth peer review with this. Michael Queens was great about finding reviewers and kind of guiding us through the process. We had two, I suppose, I don't know who the people are exactly, but the two more traditional military historians who reviewed it more on sort of the military content. And they both thought that the entire idea of doing a graphic history of the novel, one particularly said that they were actually skeptical going into the book, thinking like, is this really groundbreaking or effective? But thankfully they came out convinced by the ability of the book to kind of explore these concepts in a complex way. I mean, so from the historical perspective, we didn't have any real challenge there. McGill Queens was also, in their wisdom, correctly had someone who is involved in the production of comics and graphic novels and that sort of thing, also review the book. And they had less to say maybe about the historical content, but they were quite insightful about what we were trying to achieve with it visually. And I think that they appreciated it quite well. And one of the things that they sort of had a note about that I took took personally was that they felt like in some instances we did fall into this idea of glorifying war, of presenting sort of a an uncomplicated depiction of warfare. And that's something I definitely wanted to avoid. So I actually kind of went back and thought about it again. We added, particularly for the last chapter, to explain what we're trying to achieve in using different artistic styles, and in a way that it might be at first glance be, oh, this is just, you know, guns and battles and just explosions and trying to, you know, depict the glory of war.
Right.
And I think, but if you look at it more closely, you'll see that I hope it subverts a lot of that mythology and mystique that has grown up around heroic depictions of battle. And one of the things that I, for instance, did try to use it too much, but some of the pages, some of the pictures and pages are blood stained to emphasize that this was a bloody battle that cost 2,000 Canadians their lives. About 7,000 were wounded, and the Germans lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20,000. So, and that's sort of getting into what I mentioned before, but the ethics of depicting warfare.
Right.
Yeah, but to answer Charlotte's question, I mean, I had no problem with the peer review for this book. I've done other projects that are graphic based. I have an article in Canadian Historical Review that came out a couple of months ago. It explains some of the similar themes about how graphic history is created. And that was another kind of interesting and relatively smooth peer review process. I've tried more recently to include some illustrations in a more traditional article.
Awesome.
The article was rejected for other reasons, but one of the reviewers said, you know, they understand why I'd be using illustrations, and from their perspective is, if it's not created at the time, if it's not a cartoon from the time period or something, then, you know, why use it? So I think that shows that when you create these sort of sources, when you try to visually depict the past or use your own artistic skill in telling the past, you still need to provide some justification for it. I don't think we're at the stage yet where you can just do an unapologetic graphic history. I think we can get there, but I think until maybe the field expands to think about communicating the past beyond text, it's still going to need a text component to justify and explain visually what you're trying to do.
I see what you mean. Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you got to justify the existence of the book and the book itself, which is interesting.
Like this book, for instance. Oh, I was just going to say, I think it really is helped by the fact of having the written introductions that Rob and I wrote. I think it adds important context. In some ways, it's easier to write something. It's certainly more efficient in writing something than trying to draw everything. So that's the kind of graphic history I'm interested in. Is it includes a strong text element as well, but obviously the main focus, I think, is and should be on the pictures.
Yeah, and I agree. I used to be quite skeptical about that and everything. I mean, I used to have what I used to say, like a narrow definition and thought of all these things, and thankfully I've started to expand and put this and videos in general. I mean, I've come across sort of the same thing. There's a kind of a stigma I want to get into in a second, but we've got some people chiming in and about the whole issue with war and glorification and such. I mean, Charlotte, I think, hits the nail on the head here. I've seen this myself. I've had this sort of criticism as well. In any way, shape, or form, it's seen as a glorification. If you try to represent it in any way that's slightly different, they say, I've seen that. I've had that myself. I had that in my dissertation, which I thought was odd. There was no pictures in there. And then Gary, also kind of the same thing. Yeah, but like you can do it in different ways, and it's always been, well, like you said, and mentioning again the Commando comics and Action Comics and all that. This has always been how this has been represented, right? The war has been represented like that going on. So
Yeah, just to bring up like those Commando comics that I think some people might think at first glance when they look at it, it's about like this kind of macho depiction of war. It actually is much more complicated when you really
Yep.
look into it and you understand why it's being depicted this way and what's being depicted. Charlie's War from the 80s was a big influence for me and from my books. Just the way that it was depicting the First World War just was groundbreaking. And it did face, I think, charges of sort of, oh, this is glorification. But when you look into the stories of it, this is far from glorification. This is a stark, gritty depiction of something that's definitely not glorious.
Yeah. So, and I think that's another way to get that across, right? Because you can only do that so much with words. And that's a challenge I've faced in different instances, right? Like you mentioned the ethics of it, and there's so many different opinions out there and so many different ways of going about this and depiction of fighting and dead of war and what that means and everything. There's a ton of that going. So yeah, it's a really interesting issue that I don't think will ever stop, right? These things don't ever stop. But I think the bigger thing of talking about getting this accepted in terms of its own medium is something I think is really interesting. And what that would mean for the future, I have no idea. But to me, it's exciting because it's different. And it's interesting that the one reviewer said, if it's not from the time, it shouldn't be included, and yet everything they've ever written is not of the time, and it's okay. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like you already said, right? Like somehow visualization is somehow taken to be the reality, which it's not. It never has been.
Exactly. I mean, it's like you could study a novel from the past, and you're writing your analysis of this book. Well, you're creating a text source that obviously isn't from that time period. You could analyze a work of art or a novel or anything from the past, but instead you're communicating your research through your pictures and your drawings. And it might be more difficult, it might be more challenging for the reader, but I think that is as useful as a written text analysis of what you're trying to explain.
Yeah, and again, not to take this in a necessarily negative direction, but I do want to, I think, again, as a starter, you have to understand what's going on to kind of move forward. Other than that, has there been a lot of negativity, a lot of rejection, a lot of, just not helpful comments and that kind of thing? Have you faced that a lot, or just because it hasn't come out, like it just recently came out, is that not something you faced yet, or?
No, I haven't yet. I think that is a challenge of drawing, is that you do potentially face more criticism just because it's evident, it's on the page, people can see it. When it's written, you need to read through it, and there's all sorts of, as you know, as a fellow writer, there's sort of different tricks of the trade that you can use in argumentation that can sort of you can add certain nuances and context, and I think it's just a little more difficult for people to penetrate and criticize written text because they actually have to spend time with it. With a picture, I think you should spend as much time as you do reading, but it's evident, it's there on the page. Someone can see it, and if they reject it for whatever reason, they might feel more empowered to criticize. As I mentioned before, the issue of historical accuracy, it's always going to be a problem. Someone saying, "Oh, that this isn't quite right." What I'm attempting to do with the book is there are mistakes. I don't want to call them mistakes, but there are choices that I made for different reasons that some people might think of as mistakes.
Okay.
And what I would hope people to do is, if they see an inaccuracy or something, is to think about why it is that they might focus on that particular accuracy. For instance, just as an example, for whatever reason, when I tend to draw, although I'm right-handed, I tend to draw things left-handed. Like just there's someone throwing a grenade, and I actually have them throwing both hands, and it's just visually, I just didn't really think about it. I depict them throwing left-handed. There's an image of someone saluting left-handed.
Okay.
I only recently realized until 1917, apparently that was not uncommon in the British Army. But it's some might object to it and say, "Oh, that's incorrect." I would ask them to think about what makes that, I'd say, a super realistic depiction of someone and they're saluting left-handed. Is that more or less realistic than a stick figure who's saluting right-handed? So just to think about why it is that we focus on certain details in represent the past, and why some people might think some details are important, other people might think that no, it's more about what it evokes or the emotion that it tries to get across.
Yeah, I mean that's I like that. The sneaky making you think without telling us what's going on. I like that. Tricking people into thinking I do too. So I like it. But yeah, I think that's a great point, right? The whole historical accuracy, all that kind of thing. I mean, I see it too. It's in military history because that's what the type of history it lends to, right? They call it the rivet counting and all of that. And I'm like, I've never engaged in that because I don't see the point. Sorry, just Dave Patterson jumping in here. Poor left-handed people. My wife and father are both left-handed, so that's why I find that a little funny. Yeah, I'm gonna get the ruler out and smack them for using their left. But yeah, I mean, you see it all the time, and it's just I don't think it's why is that important or why is that the thing you focus on? I think that's a great point because the negativity out there is. Well, it's omnipresent, and it always will be. That's be as it may. But one thing I did want to ask is, and I don't know because maybe the field's not developed enough. I don't know, and maybe you could shed some light on this because I was thinking about this today because it came up. Somebody brought up a video about a Canadian involvement in the Aleutians in Kiska. A certain YouTuber who not a lot of people like represented it horribly. Not even the smallest details, the things that you could easily Google in about 2 seconds are wrong. So that I think it creates a stigma, right? That these are bad. Videos are bad. The online videos aren't accurate. They're not done well. Is that a concern with this? Like that this hasn't been done well in the past? Because I know there has been historic graphic novels and that kind of thing. Some of them are good. Some of them are not so good. Is that a concern of the field as well? That might be a speed bump, or do you see that as a barrier? I don't. If you could just shed some light on that, that would be great.
That's a question. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would say just as there can be bad written history, there definitely can be bad drawn history. But I don't think anyone should mistake the fact that it's drawn is that it might be easier. As someone who drew 240 illustrated pages, it's not easier than writing with just with text.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
I think that an issue is that I get your point. I think the issue is that those who are trained historians, those who have PhDs, and not to say that you need to have a PhD to be a historian, certainly not, but those who have the training and produce academic books are trained in emphasizes text and writing skills. So those who are creating academic books, I would say there's a tendency of that they'll be better than someone that maybe doesn't have historical knowledge, and if they're creating a artistic, historically based graphic novel, not that those are two maybe different things. So until maybe the skill of drawing or the skill of communicating in ways beyond text, whether it's video creation, whether it's gamification of history of creating video games, or different skill sets, until those are represented and privileged and emphasized more in historical training, then historians are going to tend to focus on what they're comfortable with, of creating text-based academic books. And I think there's a lot of potential for those who are interested to collaborate with artistically minded people to produce books that might have both an artistic component and a historical component, and historians can find ways of collaborating with those type of people. But I think it's also important for historians to also be the ones that can create too. I don't think it necessarily needs to be historians. They're the ones, they're the consultants or something that the creators need to check with or fact check with. I think the historians should be involved in creating these type of books too, like graphic books or like the great stuff you do with videos and everything. Like I think that's essential for communicating, and that's really what history is about. It's about communicating with the public that aren't necessarily trained in a scholarly academic way, and they might not be interested in a dense text based book, but maybe they would be in something more creative.
Yeah, and I mean, well, Gary makes a good point here. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit, but a newer, younger audience, which I mean, they might not initially engage with, like Gary says here in quotes. I like that. Like Gary put that in quotes, right? Wordy books.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like we all know what that means. But in terms of what I was also thinking, and I kind of hope you agree, is that, you know, yeah, maybe that's their first way in, but then they're like, okay, oh, there's these 50 pages at the back. That's boring. Or they go and be like, oh, cool. Like there's a whole, you know, there's that Hill 70 book that you talk about. That's a collection of basically articles talking about Hill 70. Maybe they pick that up. You know what I mean? I think that the potential for even to come back around, right? Like you're saying, it can move forward, but also people could be like, hey, I just learned about this, or I didn't know that existed, or I didn't know that's how they did it. Because not everybody knows that. Not everyone's privileged to know how academics works, right? It's a great way in. I mean, it's, to me, I don't know. I just think it's a benefit to everybody.
I think, and just to build on that comment, which I think is great, that there is a kind of a tendency in education of we graduate from picture books into, as you mentioned, wordy books, and that a text-based book is going to be more advanced than a book with pictures. So you go from purely pictures to pictures with text to graduate into text, and that's where all the nuance is. And a lot of teachers now in high schools and some universities are actually starting to look into graphic novels as sort of used to instruct students, and sometimes they even encourage students to create the kind of works themselves and kind of expanding beyond just words. It reminds me of, so I'm doing a project for a group called Defining Moments Canada, and I'm doing research into the 9-hour movements in the 1870s. So I've been looking into this publication called The Interior Workman, which was kind of the first labor newspaper in Canada. And they have an article in there about the importance, and this is like 1872, about the importance of teaching drawing to students in schools. And I thought that's just a fascinating thing to come across. And it is making the same case that could be made today about there are some concepts that maybe can be expressed better in drawing. And a labor newspaper interested in kind of craftsmanship and that kind of the artisan culture would naturally see teaching drawing as an important skill. In the 20th century, we kind of lost our way, maybe stigma against comics in the 50s or something. That's, these are childish books that you're supposed to move on from as you develop. And I think that, it's taken a while, but people are starting to think, oh, actually, no, comics and graphic novels and graphic histories and graphic scholarship generally is useful and useful skill to teach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way to put it. Like, as I've said this before, again, it's not quite the same thing, but as all the reading that I've done, there be things that they're talking about, right? And I'm like, what does that look like? I have no idea what that looks like. I didn't go through these events. I don't know, right? So that's kind of, what I used to try to do with the channel until I ran into a bumpy road because of certain policies that YouTube has, finding these things. And it doesn't matter, training, not. I would like, what is it like? Simple things like, what does it look like when they're going down the net into a landing craft? I had no idea what that looked like. I didn't know what artillery firing on a landing craft looked like. But you can do that. You can try to present that. And I mean, I don't have the skill to make animation on that. I'm not even gives me a headache thinking about it. I just, you know what I mean? Like that is to me, we're missing, right? We're missing out. If we can represent this, we can say, well, we loaded a 25-pounder on a boat. Okay, great. That means nothing. Like we know sort of what that might look like. You can bring that to life in a way, but in a way that helps us understand. To me, that is just the importance of this, and why I think like I said on Twitter the other day, like I was reading it, I'm like, this is the future. I think it is. I think this, like in terms of like this style and doing it with an online component, is going to be what it's going to have to be. You're going to have to do that in some sort of way and have an online component, or you're sunk, because no one's going to care, right? Oh, you did another monogram. Whoop-de-doo. There's great monograms out there. I'm literally sitting in front of I don't know how many, but it's just not enough anymore. And Susan makes a great point. Teaching of history is so important, whatever it takes. That's my school. That's what I think. However we get there, we get there. And I just want to say thanks to you for doing that in this way. And hopefully this keeps going, right? You said you're working with Defining Moments Canada, which is great because we had Louis from the channel, from them on. He was on. That was great. So learning about what they do and everything. So I think that's a great thing. So one thing I did want to talk about, you mentioned it way at the beginning, is the two smaller books that started this whole thing. I wonder if you could just talk about those stories real quick, because I know why the one's in there. I'm not too sure about the second one. The Fredrik Lee story you told me about. I wonder if you can speak about that first, and then the other one, why it's included as well.
Yeah. So as mentioned, we created two more graphic novels, I would call them, kind of graphic pamphlets even, about 30, 40, 50 pages. I forget how long. And so the second one we created was about Fredrik Lee, who was a Canadian-born soldier of Chinese descent. His parents were born in China. He was born in British Columbia. He enlisted in 1915. Which, and relatively rare for someone of Chinese descent to enlist and serve in an infantry battalion.
Yep.
So a very unique case. And he serves about from February 27 of 1917 until his death on August 21st at Lens in the battlefield 70 in 1917. And it's an interesting story about how did this person of Chinese descent enlist and serve in the Canadian Forces. And what we found in looking through a service file, as typically of many service files, is it is basically nothing of any particular note there that we can draw on what his actual experience was. So it lists his time of arrival into England, time of arrival to France, and then his death in August. So we have this sort of open canvas of how do we try to depict the story of Fredrik Lee. And so we based it on the sources that we have of the war diary for the 47th Battalion, which he served in. And we try to extrapolate what his experience might have been, kind of mixing speculative instances with the likely mundane things that he had witnessed. And so that project was finished in 2017, 2018 as part of a new education package that Hill 70 had created. And we knew we wanted to include his story into the graphic history. And so I thought the best way to justify it within the context of the book is to show the process by which we are attempting to narrate a relatively unknown soldier. That in some instances, as a Chinese person of Chinese descent, he was very unique. In other instances, as someone who died without leaving much of a record, he's relatively common. And so that chapter is sort of about how we are depicting a soldier that we don't have the sources to really base on a more complete version of what his life would have been. And so we contrast that with Brock Chisholm, who was the first graphic novel we created for Hill 70. So Brock Chisholm was an officer in the 15th Battalion. He was later life general in the Canadian Army and the director of medical services. He became a psychiatrist after the First World War. He later was director general of the World Health Organization after World War II. So here's someone of particular note. And we have a letter that he wrote to his father explaining his experience at Hill 70. And so in the graphic novel version, the slimmer version, which I showed here, we created more of a sort of a fictionalized telling of what his experience might have been. And then for the Through Their Eyes book, we included the letter that he wrote to his father to sort of narrate the early parts of that chapter, and then we base a lot of what follows on the War Diary, and particularly on the colonel in charge of the battalion, whose name was Charles Bent. So that was just to sort of demonstrate a contrast of here's one individual who's goes on to important things after the war that we have not unsubstantial sources for compared to most soldiers. We have a letter, we have the War Diary, we have some sources to base it on, and then compare that to a relatively unknown soldier who's I should mention, his body was never recovered after the war itself. So he is truly lost.
Yeah, again, like you said, I mean that's why I think the story is so striking and compelling. It's unique, but also it's not unique, in the most tragic way possible, right? And again, anyone who's done anything on this looked at any service record, because they're all available for the CEF. Sometimes it's 150 pages, sometimes it's 23. Seems to roll the dice sometimes, right? So it's great. I think that's a great thing to think about, again, because historical depictions, all of that stuff, I mean, people get upset about that in certain ways and other ways, and some of them are all just made up. So I mean, what's the difference, right? And you're taking an academic but historical angle on this. So I mean, again, I think you're right about the thing about stigmas and all of that, and people are of the times that they kind of maybe even grew up in, how they were treated in those ways. Again, hopefully we can get past that. But yeah, it's great. Sorry, I forgot the order of the books. I thought it was Lee first. So unfortunately, because Susan's asking about Lee, because she has lots of connections to Chinese Americans who served in the Second World War, and she's done great work with those guys. But she's asking if there's a copy. As far as I know, there isn't any left, but it's in this book.
Yeah, it's in the book. It's an entire chapter within the book. So I mean, it's expanded in the book from what it was initially. I think we did a better job of sort of adding some context to his experiences, and I was able to include more pictures. I'm much more pleased with the version we came out with in the book itself than the initial graphic novel that we had done, which was a good starting point. But yeah, it's an entire chapter within Through Their Eyes.
Perfect.
And I think that's something that visually depicting a soldier's experience can achieve. They can take someone that's unknown, that we don't really have any sources for, and we can use informed imagination and informed by historical sources of trying to depict what this person might have experienced. As opposed to if you're just going to take a purely text-based approach and strictly based on the sources that we have ultimately his service file, 20 some odd pages long, and has really no tangible information. We have a few photographs and a letter someone wrote after his death, just kind of mentioning in passing that he had died. So, I mean, that itself isn't really enough to derive a narrative from. And so what we try to do in the chapter is show how we're taking those bits and pieces to construct something that's plausible, but it's definitely not meant to be a definitive depiction
Right.
of his experience. In the same way, it's not a definitive depiction of anything in the book. It's an interpretation.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe that's a good key thing to go on. Yeah. So sorry, Susan. It's in the book. Sorry, before I go on to what I wanted to say is, you said you're happier with the second edition. If that's not a historian talking, then I don't know what is, because we're never happy with the first copy. We can always make it better. We're never happy. That's not.
Well, I mean, something I did in the book of I went through pictures, and they were constantly being revised, up until almost the last minute. So I'm pleased with all the pictures in it, but there's, as both a historian and an artist, there's always going to be just I know where time ran out or something.
Yeah, sometimes you just gotta let go, and that's no different. That's great. Sorry, I forgot what I was gonna say. I lost my train of thought there. So that's it's in the book. It's expanded. It's better. Get it where you can, for that reason, especially for Susan, because I know she's very interested in those types of stories, because she's asked me before about kind of stuff like that. So there you go, Susan. So thanks for that good question. I forgot what I was going to say. Gary, there's one thing to bring up. I don't know if you know about them. I don't know very much about them, but the Great War Group has done a bunch of illustrated histories aimed at the schools. I assume that's in the UK, because that's what they're based. But I mean, it sounds exactly kind of the same thing you're trying to do, is engage.
Well, it seems like the UK is probably advanced on us than this. I mean, they have Oxford University Press does a graphic history series, and they've done about a dozen books. The illustrated histories that you mentioned. The UK has done some great things with graphic history, and I think Canada's slowly starting to catch up. I think there is the sort of stigma against this type of source, and it's not really rigorous academic research, and Canadians maybe tend to have sort of a chip on their shoulder about that sort of thing, and they try to demonstrate that no, we're serious scholars, that we do serious academic work, and if we're doing illustrated stuff, then maybe we're not. I think it's definitely useful.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I was going to say, we have a chip on our shoulder about academic stuff. I think we have a chip on our shoulder about everything. So, I mean, it's definitely part of that. We're trying to play an old game here when we don't need to, but be as it is may. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything else you wanted to touch base with. Any last closing thoughts you might have?
Maybe one last thought about my kind of artistic style itself. What I tried to do throughout the book is kind of use some different styles to mix realism with abstract. But my standard one is sort of an illustrated, semi-cartoon, semi-realistic depiction, and someone might notice that it's kind of rough around the edges, and maybe in some cases incomplete, and that's all intentional to emphasize that what's being presented in the book is abstraction of what's being depicted. It's not, as all historians would know, and all histories are, it's not meant to be smooth and complete and polished, but it's supposed to show the roughness around the edges about how history is being created and constructed and represented and shared. Yeah, and sorry, just I think that's amazing, because again, I'm not stupid thunder, but you can't do that any other way. I would love to be able to do that, right? Be like, well, this is where it kind of looked like, and then I moved here. You can't do it with a text because it would just be nonsense. So it just doesn't work. Whereas you can do that. I mean, kind of maybe I'm saying that because maybe I'm a little jealous, but because you can't really do that in any other medium. So maybe it's a little bit jealousy on my part. Different stories at the same time. You can have a text depiction like that might be narrating one particular interpretation, and you have the illustrations that are depicting another. Sometimes the text reinforces the pictures. Sometimes they're in juxtaposition and contrast. So I think there's just an enormous amount that you can do with this sort of graphic history concept. Yeah, that's great. I think that's a good way to end off. So I'm just going to do a quick sign off, and then I'll come say goodbye together. Okay? That sounds good. So there we go. So thanks everyone for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did. Again, get the book, links down below, particularly for our Canadian audience. So check it out. Only $20 through Indigo.
Like Matt already said, yeah, he spent years. the drawing alone and the art style is worth more than $20. So definitely get it while it's on sale at that price now. It's just been released in the paperback. So get it. And Matt's also done serious, as we talked about the whole differentiating thing. He's done serious work as well. You can check out his other live stream. I'll link it down below when we're finished here. But thanks for coming on. Again, if you like the work I'm doing, please like and subscribe. It helps a lot, as does leaving comments down below after the fact to help kind of kick in the algorithm. So coming up on the channel, I'm going to be having Project 44 on this week. Coming up, I believe on the 18th. I'm not sure about the time. I have to double check, but having them on because they're releasing a Dieppe map, which I've seen a beta version of. It's mind blowing. It's going to change again, kind of like Matt's work. We're going to change how we look at these things and understand them. It's going to be mind blowing in that respect. And also later in the week as well, I'm going to be at the Canadian War Museum. They're finally got the vehicles up and running again. So keep an eye out for that stuff. I don't know what they're going to have. I think they're bringing out the Universal Carrier. Some of you know my love for that thing. So maybe I'll do a live stream with that. Who knows? So keep an eye out for that as well. And again, if you can become a patron, or a YouTube channel team member of OTD, please do. Links to all that is down below. Also, you can hit that join button to become a team member. So check that out if you can. Again, I'll use all that to help keep OTD going and keep updating stuff and making the channel better all the time. So thanks for coming on again, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, and just kind of one last push for my different projects. As you can see behind me, Scandalous Conduct is there, which will be out by UBC Press in paperback in November. So non-illustrated, but still I think pretty interesting, pretty good. And just maybe one last push for the book is, I mean, it just, I can't say enough about what a job Miguel Queens did.
Yeah.
In putting this together, and just such a like this, such a substantial type of book, and you know it's creative, and I think it's unique, and I don't think anyone's really attempted that sort of thing through University Press, at least not that much. So as Brad mentioned, you can find the links through his channel, and if you order from Indigo, I understand that you'll manage to get a bit of support, which is fantastic. So, well, I mean, listen,
I'll take it.
Anything on this either. So
yeah, I'll take it.
As I mean, $20 for 300 plus page, and if you want to go a bit higher, about 35 for the hardcover, or both. I think that it's just, I can't say enough about, you know, I know my co-author Robert Engen is just as thrilled as I am with what we've produced.
Yeah, I mean, as not part of the project, I am, as I keep saying, excited. So, I mean, hopefully we see more of this, and maybe we get some support behind you, and we'll make you do more, work. How's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. Hopefully there are some projects on the go, but I'll hold off on explaining anything about that until some more details.
Maybe we can have you on again later, depending on what you got going on. So again, thanks everyone for watching. So make sure you have notifications on for the channel so you don't miss the stuff that's coming up this week. So I will see everyone next time, and have a good rest of your Sunday. Bye, everybody.